They tell me I was the first human to see a Dargo face to face, stand close enough to smell the wet copper stink of its skin, and live to talk about it. That's true as far as it goes. What they leave out is that I was also the first to be laughed at, the first to be called a liar to his face by men I'd shared coffee with for 6 years, and the first to spend a decade wondering if maybe they were right. My name is Zanfretta. I was a night patrolman for a private security cooperative in Porto Ligure, which is what we called the harbor settlement on the southern shelf of Vesta Novara. 17,000 people packed into a crescent of old prefab towers and repurposed cargo containers, all of it clinging to the cliffs above a slate-colored sea that never got warm. The kind of place people come to because they ran out of options somewhere else, and stay because leaving costs more than staying. I walked the perimeter roads 6 nights a week, checking locks, rattling gates, making sure nobody was stripping copper out of the relay stations. It was honest work, boring work, the kind of work that lets your mind drift until the dark starts playing tricks on you. December of that year, 26 years before the invasion, if you can believe the gap, I was doing a sweep along the ridgeline above Marzano, the little cluster of service buildings east of town. No moon. Fog so thick I could feel it on my teeth. I came around the corner of a water pumping station, and my flashlight hit something that wasn't a wall and wasn't a man. It was standing in the drainage culvert, 3 meters tall, shoulders wider than the doorframe behind it. The skin was green, not the bright green of paint but the deep murky green of harbor water at depth, and it had ridges, folds, like the thing's whole body was wrapped in something that was either fat or armor. The head was too large. The eyes were yellow and triangular, and they caught my light and threw it back at me the way a cat's eyes do, except there was nothing behind them that I recognized as thought. Not animal thought, not human thought, something else entirely. It didn't move. I didn't move. And then something pushed into my head, not a sound, not words exactly, but a pressure that carried meaning the way a current carries debris. I understood, without understanding how I understood, that it was looking at me the way I might look at a piece of equipment, assessing function, determining whether I was useful or in the way. I dropped my flashlight and ran. I'm not ashamed of that. Any man who tells you he wouldn't run is either lying or hasn't seen what I saw. Nobody believed me. The cooperative let me keep my job because I'd never been any trouble before, but they pulled my sidearm permit and put me on day shifts for 3 months. People I'd known for years suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. The local news ran a small piece. There were jokes. Someone spray-painted a green face on my locker. After a while, I stopped talking about it. You learn to carry certain things quietly when the alternative is losing everything else. I went through a period where I agreed to be examined. Hypnosis sessions, recorded, played back for committees that studied such things. Under the trance, I repeated everything exactly as it had happened: the culvert, the green skin, the triangular eyes, the telepathic push. They told me my vital signs were consistent with genuine recall, not fabrication. It didn't matter. Consistent with genuine recall still left room for genuine recall of a hallucination, and that was the gap everyone chose to stand in. I stopped doing the sessions. I went back to walking my routes and keeping my mouth shut. 26 years I carried it. 26 years of walking night routes and flinching at shadows and wondering. And then, on the 31st of April, a date that shouldn't exist on any calendar, which tells you something about the Dargos' sense of either humor or contempt, they came back. All of them. The first ship appeared at dawn. I was having coffee on my balcony, 5th floor, east-facing, the same cup I had every morning. I thought it was a cloud at first, a low dark mass rolling in off the sea. But clouds don't hold still. Clouds don't have edges that catch the light like polished bone. It was enormous, 1/2 kilometer wide at least, shaped like a flattened disc with a central spine that curved upward like the keel of an overturned ship. It settled over the harbor mouth without a sound. No engine noise, no displaced air. It was just suddenly there, the way a bruise is suddenly there after you've forgotten the impact. Within an hour there were more. Smaller craft, each one the size of a cargo hauler, dropping out of the belly of the main vessel and spreading across the ridgelines in the coastal flats. They came down softly, almost gently, the way a man sets down a glass he doesn't want to break. The whole city stopped. I mean that literally. Traffic froze, construction rigs went idle, the morning shift at the docks never clocked in. 17,000 people standing in the streets with their faces turned up, watching the sky fill with something that wasn't ours. I knew what they were before anyone else did. I felt that pressure again, that wordless push against the inside of my skull, and this time it carried something almost like amusement. They remembered me. The coffee cup in my hand was shaking. I set it down on the railing and gripped the metal with both hands and watched the shadow of the mother ship crawl across the harbor like a slow eclipse. My neighbor, old Baccini from the 4th floor, came out onto his balcony in his undershirt and said something I couldn't hear. His mouth was moving, but the blood in my ears was louder. I think he asked me what it was. I think I said, "I told you." I don't remember if he heard me either. Commander Malherbe was off-world when it started. He was the closest thing Porto Ligure had to a genuine hero, a former deep space pilot who'd flown the first crewed mission out of our sector, the first man from our colony to see Titan's rings with his own eyes. He'd been up at the orbital station running a training exercise with a crew of 6 when the Dargos arrived. We didn't know it at the time, but that accident of scheduling would end up mattering more than anything else. The first 3 days were strange. Not violent, strange. The Dargos came out of their ships and walked among us, and they were exactly as I remembered, 3 meters tall, green-ridged skin, those flat yellow eyes, but they carried no visible weapons and they moved slowly, almost carefully, as if they were afraid of stepping on something small. They communicated telepathically, and what they communicated was friendship. Cultural exchange, they called it, learning. They wanted to understand how we lived, what we built, what we ate, how we organized ourselves. They attended public meetings. They walked through the markets. A group of them stood in the harbor for an entire afternoon watching the fishing boats come and go, and the pressure in my head translated their collective emotion as something close to nostalgia. I learned later what that nostalgia meant. The Dargos were not alien in the way we assumed, not visitors from some distant star with no connection to our kind. They were old. Impossibly old. Their own histories claimed they had been the first intelligent species to walk on a world like ours, millions of years before our branch of evolution had learned to stand upright. They had left driven out by some catastrophe they no longer spoke of clearly, and resettled on a moon they called Titania, out in the cold margins of another system. But Titania was dying. Had been dying for millennia slowly, the way a candle burns down. The atmosphere thinning, the core cooling, the light going out of a world 1 degree at a time. And they had come back to the kind of world they remembered, looking for a place to live again. The nostalgia the harbor Dargos felt watching our fishing boats was real. They were homesick for a home that hadn't been theirs for longer than our species had existed. They watched our children running on the docks and our old men playing cards in the harbor cafes, and I honestly think part of them envied us. Not our technology, not our cities, our carelessness, the way we lived as though the ground beneath us would always be there. That doesn't make what they did next forgivable. It just makes it comprehensible. People relaxed. That was the worst part looking back. People actually relaxed. The initial terror faded into curiosity and then into something almost like pride. We'd been chosen, our little backwater port, out of all the settlements on Vesta Novara. The Dargos had come to us. The regional governor gave a speech about cooperation between species. Vendors started selling food from carts set up near the landing sites. Children drew pictures of the tall green visitors and taped them to the school windows. A comedian named Vergasola did a routine on the public broadcast channel about trying to share a meal with a Dargo, and people laughed, and the laughter made them feel safe. I didn't relax. I kept thinking about the way that first one had looked at me in the drainage culvert 26 years ago, assessing function, determining whether I was useful or in the way. That's not how you look at a neighbor. That's how you look at inventory. Andrea was the one who figured it out first, or at least the first who said it out loud. Andrea Deba, communications tech, worked the relay station on the East Ridge, the kind of woman who noticed when numbers didn't add up. She pulled me aside on the fourth morning and showed me her screen. The Dargos had been transmitting since arrival, low frequency, tightly focused, aimed not at us but at each other and at the mother ship. Andrea had been quietly recording and running pattern analysis. "They're mapping us," she said, "grid by grid. Every power junction, every water main, every structural support in every building in Porto Ligure. This isn't cultural exchange, Zanfretta. This is a target survey." I looked at the data. Columns and columns of numbers I couldn't read, but the pattern was clear even to me. Concentric rings spreading out from the harbor. The same systematic sweep a demolitions team would run before bringing down a building. We tried to warn people. We went to the port authority, to the governor's office, to the dock foreman. Nobody wanted to hear it. The Dargos were peaceful. The Dargos were sharing technology. The Dargos had promised a joint athletic exhibition, a match at the Marassi Stadium, their team against ours, a symbol of goodwill between species. The governor himself was organizing it. To suggest hostility now was irresponsible, paranoid, the kind of thinking that started wars. Andrea looked at me across the table in the Port Authority office after the third official told us to go home. "They're going to take the city during the match," she said. "Every human in Porto Ligure packed into one stadium, every street empty, every defense post unmanned." She was right. She was exactly right. The match was scheduled for the 7th day. A combined team, Genoasamp they called it, pulling players from both of the city's rival football clubs, old enemies standing shoulder to shoulder for once. They even brought in Prazzo and Decina, retired legends who hadn't suited up in years but couldn't refuse the call when the stakes were framed as representing the species. The whole thing had a carnival atmosphere. Face paint, banners, songs echoing through the streets as people walked to the stadium in groups, families, whole neighborhoods moving together. The Marassi held 12,000. Nearly every adult in Porto Ligure planned to attend. The governor had declared a civic holiday. Underneath the festival, invisible to everyone who wasn't looking, the Dargos were positioning. I couldn't reach Malherbe directly. He was on the orbital station, and the Dargos had done something to the primary comm relays. Nothing as obvious as jamming, just a persistent interference that degraded signal quality enough to make real-time communication unreliable. But Andrea knew the relay systems better than anyone alive. She spent 2 nights rigging a workaround, bouncing a compressed data burst through 3 secondary nodes, and a mining satellite that hadn't been used in a decade. She barely slept. I brought her coffee and watched her solder connections with hands that trembled from fatigue, not fear. The message we sent was short: Dargos hostile, mapping city for seizure, assault likely during stadium match, come home. We didn't know if it got through. We didn't know if Malherbe would believe it even if it did. All we could do was wait and try to convince a city full of people who were busy painting their faces for a football match that the tall green visitors smiling down at them from behind those yellow eyes were counting the minutes until every human in Porto Ligure was penned in one place. Box, that was his call sign, real name Massimo, was the first person who listened. He was a dock foreman built like a loading crane, hands the size of hull plates. He'd been watching the Dargos too, and what he'd noticed was simpler than Andrea's data, but just as damning. "They don't eat," he said. 7 days and not one of them has eaten anything. They accept the food people offer and they hold it and they walk away with it, and nobody's ever seen one actually put anything in its mouth. You don't travel across a galaxy for cultural exchange and forget to pack lunch. Box brought others. Shorty, who ran cargo shuttles and knew every access tunnel under the port. Roby Tenso, a medic from the harbor clinic who kept a trauma kit in her locker and another in her shuttle. Sarah Giotto, an engineer who maintained the settlement's power grid and had been filing ignored maintenance reports for the better part of a decade. Marco Medico, a logistics coordinator who could track inventory across 6 warehouses from memory. Laura Simpson, a researcher from the science division who'd been studying the Dargos' language patterns and had independently concluded that their telepathic vocabulary contained no word for negotiation, only for instruction. Nobody with military training, nobody with authority, just working people who looked at the numbers and trusted their own eyes more than the governor's speeches. We met in the basement of the relay station the night before the match. 9 of us around a folding table, a single overhead light buzzing, Andrea's data scrolling on a cracked screen. Nobody made speeches. Nobody talked about heroism or sacrifice or duty. Box laid out a map of the tunnel system that Sarah had sketched from memory. Andrea showed us the frequency analysis and explained what the modulators could do and, more importantly, what they couldn't. 30 seconds of disruption, maybe 40 if we were lucky, and then the Dargos systems would recalibrate and the window would close. Shorty calculated charge placement. Marco figured out logistics. Who carried what, how fast, through which route. Laura pointed out that the Dargos' telepathic hierarchy was centralized, meaning if we could disorient the command signal, the soldiers would lose coordination before they lost capability. That distinction mattered. Disoriented soldiers can still fight, but they can't fight together, and together was the only advantage the Dargos had over 12,000 angry humans. The plan we put together was ugly and simple and desperate because those were the only materials we had. When it was done, we sat in silence for a while. Then Box folded the map, put it in his jacket and said, "Noon tomorrow, don't be late." And we went home to sleep, or try to. The match started at noon. By 11:30, the streets were empty. Box was right about that. The Dargos had timed it perfectly. 12,000 humans packed into Marassi Stadium, cheering, stamping their feet, waving flags. The Genoa Samp team walked out onto the pitch to a roar that shook the upper decks. The Dargos team followed, 7 of them, each one towering over the human players, moving with that slow, deliberate grace that I'd learned to read as predatory patience. The crowd loved it. They cheered louder. They thought they were watching history, 2 species meeting in friendly competition. They didn't see the armored figures moving into position beneath the stands. And outside the stadium in the empty streets, the Dargos moved. They hit the power grid first. Sarah had predicted that. The settlement went dark, not all at once, but section by section, a rolling blackout that spread from the harbor up the hill like a wave. Then the water mains. Then the comm relays, all of them this time, not the subtle interference they'd been running before, but a hard shutdown. In 90 seconds, Porto Ligure was blind, deaf, and dark. Inside the stadium, the crowd didn't understand at first. The lights went out, but it was midday, bright enough under the open sky. People muttered, checked their handhelds, found no signal. A few stood up. A few headed for the exits. And then the Dargos on the pitch changed. I was watching from the upper concourse. I'd refused to sit in the stands, and I saw it happen. The 7 players stopped pretending. They straightened to their full height, and that telepathic pressure slammed into every human skull in the stadium simultaneously. "Sit down, stay still. This city is no longer yours." The panic was instantaneous. 12,000 people tried to move at once, and the exits were already blocked. Dargos soldiers, not the friendly ambassadors who'd walked the markets, but armored figures in dark plating who'd been waiting in the access tunnels beneath the stadium, sealed every gate. The mother ship above the harbor shifted, tilted, and the underside lit up with something that made the air taste like burning metal. A warning shot hit the Lanterna, the old lighthouse tower on the harbor point, the symbol of Porto Ligure, the first thing sailors saw coming home. And it came apart in a column of white fire that left nothing but a blackened stump and a cloud of powdered stone. They destroyed it to prove they could. They destroyed it because it was ours, and they wanted us to understand that nothing we'd built mattered to them. That was the moment the Dargos expected us to break. 3-meter telepaths with warships and directed energy weapons had just decapitated our city's oldest landmark and sealed 12,000 people in a stadium like livestock. Any rational species would have surrendered. The Dargos had done this before. I learned that later from the captured data cores. They'd taken 17 worlds the same way. Infiltrate, befriend, map, isolate, decapitate. It had never failed. They were ancient, patient, and methodical, and they had never encountered a species stupid enough to fight back after the demonstration. They hadn't met us. Malarba's shuttle hit atmosphere 12 minutes after the Lanterna fell. He'd gotten our message. He'd believed it. Later, he told me he'd believed it because he'd read my original contact report from 26 years ago, and he'd never thought I was lying. He came in hard and fast with a crew of 6, no weapons worth mentioning, one atmospheric shuttle that wasn't rated for combat, and a plan that was even uglier than ours. But we didn't know he was coming. All we knew in that basement relay station was that the power was out, the comms were dead, and 12,000 of our people were trapped in a stadium with creatures who had just burned our lighthouse to prove a point. Andrea got one relay back online. I don't know how. She pulled components from 2 dead units, soldered connections with a maintenance iron that was never designed for circuit work, and jury-rigged a low-power transmitter that could reach maybe 3 kilometers. Not enough to call the orbital station, but enough to reach Box, who was positioned at the docks with Shorty and a cargo shuttle full of mining charges. The plan was simple. The Dargos had mapped our infrastructure, but they'd mapped it from the top: power grid, water mains, communication relays, the things a conquering force cares about. They hadn't mapped what was underneath. Porto Ligure was built on old colonial foundations, and those foundations were riddled with service tunnels, drainage channels, and maintenance shafts that didn't appear on any current schematic because they'd been sealed and forgotten 30 years ago. Sarah knew about them because she'd been patching leaks in the power conduits that ran through them for years and filing maintenance reports that nobody read. The Dargos controlled the surface. We went under it. Shorty moved first, threading his cargo shuttle through the sub-harbor channel, a passage meant for maintenance submersibles, barely wide enough, the hull scraping rock on both sides. The sound was terrible, a grinding shriek of composite on stone that echoed through the channel and made my teeth ache even from 200 meters away. He carried a string of mining charges borrowed from the quarry east of town. Not weapons. Industrial tools designed to break rock. But a shaped charge doesn't care what you call it. Box and I went into the tunnels on foot. The dark down there was absolute: no lights, no reference points, just the sound of our own breathing and the occasional drip of condensation from overhead pipes that hadn't been serviced in a generation. The water was ankle-deep in places, cold enough to numb my feet through my boots. Box moved like a man half his size, quiet and certain, one hand on the tunnel wall for navigation, and I followed his lead because he'd spent 20 years loading cargo in tighter spaces than this. We carried Andrea's relay unit, a battery pack, and a set of frequency modulators that Sarah had built out of scavenged parts from her maintenance locker. The Dargos communicated telepathically, but their ships and their weapon systems used a carrier frequency, a kind of subsonic hum that Andrea had identified in her recordings. Sarah's modulators were designed to disrupt that frequency. Not jam it. We didn't have the power for that, but introduce enough noise to force their systems into a reset cycle. 30 seconds of confusion. That was all we could buy. 30 seconds. The entire liberation of Porto Ligure rested on 30 seconds of induced static. I said that to Box in the dark, not because he needed to hear it, but because I needed to say it out loud to understand how insane it was. He didn't answer for a while. Then he said, "I've unloaded cargo in worse odds." I didn't ask him to explain what that meant. Some comfort doesn't need to make sense. We surfaced inside the stadium's substructure, beneath the east stands. I could hear the crowd above us, not cheering now but murmuring, the low collective sound of 12,000 frightened people trying to be quiet, trying not to draw attention. A child was crying somewhere in the upper tiers. The sound carried through the concrete like a blade. The Dargos had posted guards at every exit, but they hadn't thought to guard the maintenance hatches because they didn't know the hatches existed. I climbed up through a hatch into a service corridor behind the east concourse and looked out through a ventilation grill at the pitch below. The Dargos commander was standing at the center circle, 3 meters of ridged green authority, broadcasting telepathic instructions to the crowd. Sit, wait, comply. The humans in the stands sat with their hands in their laps and their eyes down, and the ones who didn't, the ones who stood up, who shouted, who tried to push through the exits, were put down quickly and without drama by the armored soldiers at the gates. Not killed, just dropped, the way you'd flick a switch. Telepathic suppression. The body simply stopped cooperating with the brain. They fell where they stood, and the people around them caught them and laid them down gently and sat back down, because what else could they do? I set up the relay and the modulators in the service corridor. Box positioned the charges Shorty had brought in not to destroy but to open. We wired 3 emergency exits that the Dargos had sealed and placed charges to blow them simultaneously. My hands were shaking. They'd been shaking since the lantern had burned. I couldn't make them stop, so I stopped trying and let them shake while I worked. Box noticed. He didn't say anything about it. He just handed me tools, grip first, steady, so I could take them without fumbling. Andrea counted down over the relay. Sarah threw her modulators at 14 minutes past 1. The effect was immediate. Every Dargo in the stadium staggered. The telepathic pressure vanished from my head like a hand lifting off my chest, and the relief was so sudden it made me gasp. The commander's yellow eyes went wide and unfocused, and for the first time I saw something in a Dargo face that I recognized: confusion. Genuine confusion. The frequency their entire command structure ran on had turned to soup, and for 30 seconds they were just tall green creatures standing in a stadium full of primates who suddenly remembered they were angry. Box blew the exits. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space. 3 simultaneous detonations that tore the sealed gates off their tracks and sent fragments of metal and composite raining across the concourse. Daylight flooded in. Cold air from the harbor rolled through the stadium in a wave that smelled like salt and stone dust and freedom. And I know that last word sounds dramatic, but I don't have a better one. After what those people had felt, the telepathic weight, the powerlessness, being forced to sit in their own city and watch their landmark burn, fresh air through an open door was freedom. There is no other word for it. And 12,000 humans, released from telepathic paralysis, given back their legs and their fury and 3 open doors, did what humans do when you cage them and burn their landmarks and tell them to sit still. They moved. Not all of them fought. Most ran, and that was right: families, children, the elderly. They poured through the blown exits and scattered into the streets. But enough stayed. Enough turned toward the Dargos with nothing but their fists and their voices and the absolute unwillingness to be inventory. Dock workers and shopkeepers and retired engineers and a night patrolman who'd been carrying this weight for 26 years. We didn't have weapons. We had numbers and rage, and the 30 seconds of confusion that Sarah's modulators had bought us. That was when Malibu arrived. His shuttle came in over the harbor at full atmospheric speed, low enough to rattle windows, trailing a sonic boom that rolled across the city like thunder. He'd rigged the shuttle's communication array, the one piece of equipment on board with real power, to broadcast Sarah's disruption frequency on a continuous loop, amplified through the ship's hull like the world's ugliest loudspeaker. The effect on the Dargos was devastating. Their telepathic network, already fragmented by our ground-based modulators, collapsed entirely. Individual Dargos stumbled, fell, clawed at their own heads. The armored soldiers dropped their containment formations and milled in the streets like men who'd just been spun around blindfolded. Malherbe's crew, 6 people in flight suits, armed with nothing heavier than emergency flare guns, coordinated with Andrea over the restored relay. They made 3 passes over the mother ship while Shorty, bless his reckless heart, drove his cargo shuttle straight up the sub-harbor channel and planted his remaining mining charges on the underside of the vessel's central spine. He told me later that he scraped so much hull plating off in that channel that his shuttle looked like it had been through a rock grinder. He told me that like it was funny. Shorty always did have a strange sense of humor about things that should have killed him. The mothership didn't explode. It wasn't built to explode. The Dargos engineered their vessels to be durable, resilient, permanent, built to last longer than civilizations. But Shorty's charges cracked the spine, and a ship that size with a cracked spine can't hold atmosphere. The hull breached in 11 places simultaneously. Emergency systems kicked in, pulling the vessel upward, away from the settlement, trying to seal and stabilize. It listed like a wounded animal, trailing vapor, the bone-white surface going dark in patches as internal systems failed one by one. The Dargos on the ground felt it. I watched the commander in the stadium, still standing, still conscious despite the frequency disruption, turn its yellow eyes skyward and see its ship dying. And the emotion that came through, even without the telepathic link, was not anger. It was disbelief, pure, unprocessed disbelief. They had done this 100 times. They had conquered species that could bend light and species that could manipulate gravity and species that lived in the hearts of stars. And they were being beaten by dockworkers with mining charges, and a patrolman with a 26-year grudge, and a retired astronaut in a shuttle that wasn't even rated for combat. The fighting lasted another 3 hours. It wasn't pretty and it wasn't heroic in the way the stories make it sound. People got hurt. Roby Tenso set up a triage station in the stadium parking structure and worked for 9 hours straight with her hands inside people who needed her to be steady, and 3 of the people she worked on didn't make it. Their names were Giordano, Preti, and a young dock loader named Kazil who was 23 and had a dog waiting at home. I learned their names later. I say them when I can because somebody should. Box took a telepathic hit that dropped him for 20 minutes, and when he got up, he couldn't remember his daughter's name for 2 days. Andrea burned out both her hands on a shorted relay panel and had to have the skin grafted afterward. She went back to work 6 weeks later with new skin and steady hands and the same look in her eyes that said she'd do it again without hesitation. But we held. The Dargos, cut off from their network, stripped of their ship, surrounded by a city full of humans who refused to process the concept of surrender, did what any rational species would do when the math stopped working. They stopped fighting. Not a formal capitulation. The Dargos didn't have the cultural framework for surrender. Not really. Not after 1,000,000 years of never needing one. They simply stopped advancing and stood still. And one by one, they allowed themselves to be gathered and guided back toward their grounded shuttle craft. Malherbe handled the endgame. He was good at that, the calm voice, the steady hand, the man who'd seen the rings of Titan and understood that the universe was large enough for more than one kind of stubbornness. He negotiated their departure. Not a treaty, not an alliance. Just a door held open and a clear message. Leave and don't come back to this city. Laura Simpson helped translate the terms, such as they were, working through the fragments of telepathic vocabulary she'd cataloged during the peaceful days. The Dargos didn't argue. They didn't threaten. They simply looked at us with those yellow eyes, 17,000 small, short-lived creatures who just dismantled a conquest that had never failed, and they left. The mother ship, limping and dark, pulled itself out of the atmosphere on backup systems. It rose slowly, painfully, listing 10 degrees to port, shedding fragments of hull plating that tumbled down through the clouds like pale leaves. The smaller craft followed in loose formation, some of them damaged, all of them diminished. I stood on the east ridge and watched them go. The last shuttle lifted off from the coastal flat where it had landed 7 days ago, and the ground beneath it was scorched black in a perfect circle, and in the circle nothing would grow for years. By nightfall the sky over Porto Ligure was empty again, just stars and the thin smear of the orbital station's running lights. I stood on my balcony that night with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Old Baccini from the 4th floor was on his balcony too, and this time neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say that the silence didn't say better. The harbor was dark. The power grid was still down, would be for days, but I could see lights moving along the waterfront. Handheld lanterns, flashlights, the blue glow of emergency strips. People moving through the streets, cleaning up, checking on each other, sharing water and blankets, and whatever food hadn't been ruined when the mains went down. Beginning the work of putting things back together the way people always do when the worst is over and the only thing left is the labor. Somewhere down on the docks, someone was singing. Not a victory song. Something older, quieter, the kind of thing a man sings when he's tired and grateful to be tired because tired means alive. The lanterna was gone, just that blackened stump on the point, and I knew it would take years to rebuild. Maybe they'd build something different. Maybe they'd leave the stump as it was, a reminder. 17 worlds, the captured data said. The Dargos had taken 17 worlds before they came to ours, and on every one of those worlds the same playbook had worked. Infiltrate, befriend, map, isolate, demonstrate, collect the surrender and move in. Clean, efficient, bloodless. The Dargos weren't cruel, I'll give them that. They were simply so far beyond cruelty that the concept didn't apply. You don't feel cruel when you reorganize a shelf. They just never accounted for a species that would look at a burning lighthouse and get angry instead of afraid. They never planned for a night patrolman who'd been laughed at for a quarter century and was too stubborn to stop believing what he'd seen. They never imagined a communications tech who'd spend 2 sleepless nights soldering a transmitter together because the alternative was giving up, or a dock foreman who'd walk into absolute darkness under a conquered city because someone had to carry the charges and he had the biggest hands. They never calculated the shuttle pilot who'd grind his own hull to scrap to plant explosives on a warship, or the medic who'd work until she couldn't stand because there were still people on the table, or the astronaut who'd come screaming back through atmosphere in a training shuttle because a woman he'd never met sent him a message that said, "Come home." The Dargos were old, ancient. They'd crossed galaxies and outlived civilizations, and they understood patience and power and the cold arithmetic of conquest better than any species alive. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand because it wasn't in their wiring, was that humans don't do arithmetic when they're angry. We don't calculate odds. We don't assess strategic viability. We see something that's ours burning and we go toward the fire, not away from it. And if that makes us stupid, then fine. Call us stupid. We'll be stupid together, with mining charges and jury-rigged transmitters and hands that won't stop shaking until the job is done. Malherbe told me something, weeks later. When the power was back on and the inquiries were grinding through their procedures, and people were starting to treat me like something other than the town lunatic. He said the Dargos had sent a final transmission as they left the system. One sentence, broadcast in the clear, no encryption, as if they wanted to make sure we heard it. They are not what we expected. I keep that sentence in my head. I carry it the way I carried the memory of that first encounter for 26 years, not as a trophy, but as a weight. A reminder that something in us frightened a species that had never known fear. We were night patrolmen and dock workers and medics and shuttle pilots and communications techs and engineers. We were ordinary people in an ordinary city who did an extraordinary thing not because we were brave, but because we were stubborn and scared and unwilling to sit down when someone told us to. The lantern is gone. They're talking about rebuilding it, and I suppose they will. But I still walk the perimeter roads at night sometimes, checking locks, rattling gates, old habits. And sometimes when the fog rolls in off that cold slate sea and the dark gets thick enough to feel on my teeth, I stop and look up at the stars and I think about 17 worlds that surrendered and one that didn't. One was enough.